In 1509, England stood at the edge of the Renaissance, inheriting a full treasury and a stable, austere government from the miserly Henry VII. The succession of his athletic, charismatic son promised a golden age of optimism. Yet, the greatest irony of 16th-century Europe is that the modern English nation-state was forged not by a visionary architect, but by a paranoid king's biological failure. To secure a single male heir, Henry VIII traded the stability of the medieval order for absolute control, dismantling 1,000 years of religious infrastructure and executing the very geniuses who built his empire. This is the ultimate trade-off of dynastic obsession. The history books often reduce his reign to a colorful soap opera of 6 wives. That nursery rhyme is a distraction. The matrimonial carousel was not a romantic quirk, but the clinical footprint of a systemic leadership failure. Every annulment, execution, and religious schism was a calculated mechanism to solve his singular inability to produce a healthy son. Henry VIII transformed the English state, but his monumental achievements were entirely accidental byproducts of his own vanity. The pursuit of dynastic immortality demanded a staggering human cost, turning a promising Renaissance prince into a volatile autocrat who consumed his own court. For the first half of his reign, Henry VIII did not rule alone. He governed in a formidable partnership with Thomas Wolsey, the son of an Ipswich butcher who achieved a meteoric rise to become the most powerful man in England besides the king himself. By 1515, Wolsey was Lord Chancellor and a cardinal, acting as the state's chief executive. For over a decade, this arrangement worked with ruthless efficiency. While Henry pursued the glories of kingship, jousting, feasting, and the performance of power, Wolsey managed the machinery of government. He was a tireless administrator and an astute diplomat who centralized royal authority, reformed the justice system, and navigated the treacherous currents of European politics. He modernized the English state, making it more responsive to the crown's will than ever before. This symbiotic relationship, however, was built on a fatal condition: Wolsey's continued ability to satisfy the king's personal demands. The singular point of collapse came with Henry's great matter, his obsessive quest for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. Henry required a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, and when Catherine could not provide one, he demanded that Wolsey secure a papal dissolution of the marriage. But this was a task beyond even Wolsey's immense power. Pope Clement VII was effectively a prisoner of Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, making an annulment politically impossible. Wolsey's failure to deliver on this intensely personal objective rendered his 15 years of loyal service worthless. In 1529, Henry stripped him of his offices, seized his vast wealth, and charged him with treason. Wolsey died in disgrace while traveling to London to face certain execution. His fall established the brutal operating principle of Henry's reign. Competence and statecraft were secondary to the king's dynastic obsession. The most capable servants were merely tools to be discarded the moment they failed to satisfy their master's will. The failure to secure an annulment through Cardinal Wolsey left Henry VIII at a political dead end. His dynastic ambition required a legitimate male heir, but the Pope, under the thumb of Catherine of Aragon's nephew, would not grant a divorce. Henry's solution was not a crisis of faith, but a hostile takeover of religious infrastructure. The supreme irony is that in 1521, the Pope had named him Defender of the Faith for his treatise attacking Martin Luther. Less than a decade later, Henry would use the very arguments of the Reformation he had condemned as a tool to dismantle papal authority in his own kingdom. This was not a theological conversion, it was a strategic pivot. The break with Rome was engineered through a series of parliamentary acts, culminating in the 1534 Act of Supremacy. This legislation didn't make England Protestant, it made the English Church national, declaring the king its supreme head. The immediate problem of the great matter was solved. With the Pope's jurisdiction eliminated, Henry's own hand-picked Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cromwell, could grant the annulment, legitimizing his secret marriage to Anne Boleyn and any heir she might produce. The Church was no longer an independent power, but an instrument of the state, its authority now wielded by the Crown. Beyond solving his marital problem, the break provided a staggering financial windfall. The dissolution of the monasteries, beginning in 1536, was a systematic asset seizure. Centuries of accumulated wealth, land, gold, and treasures held by over 800 religious houses were transferred to the Crown. This colossal injection of capital freed Henry from reliance on parliamentary taxes and funded his military ambitions. Furthermore, by selling off monastic lands to the nobility and rising gentry, he created a powerful new class of stakeholders whose status and fortune were now inextricably linked to the success of his religious revolution. The English Reformation was not born from piety, but from a king's desperate need for an heir and a pragmatic grab for land and power. With the break from Rome complete, Henry I needed an operator, not a prince of the church. He found one in Thomas Cromwell. Where Cardinal Wolsey had been a grand statesman who managed the existing medieval system, Cromwell was a low-born administrator who systematically rebuilt it. A blacksmith's son, he possessed a genius for bureaucracy and a complete absence of sentiment, making him the perfect instrument to institutionalize the king's revolution. Cromwell's primary achievement was transforming England's government into a functional, modern state. He professionalized the administration, creating new financial departments like the Court of Augmentations to manage the immense wealth seized from the monasteries. He elevated the role of Parliament, using it as a legislative engine to pass the statutes that cemented the royal supremacy and gave the king's will the force of law. This created a government based on statute and bureaucratic process, not just the personal authority of a chief minister. The power of the crown was now hardwired into the state itself, a system designed for permanence. But this administrative genius had a brutal application. When Anne Boleyn failed to produce a son and Henry's interest shifted to Jane Seymour, it was Cromwell who engineered the solution. He orchestrated a swift and terrifying purge, fabricating charges of adultery, incest, and treason against the Queen and a handful of courtiers. A confession was extracted under torture from a court musician, and within weeks, Anne was tried and executed in May 1536. It was a masterpiece of political demolition, demonstrating the cold logic of survival in Henry's court. Failure to produce an heir was a capital offense. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. The transition was seamless, a testament to Cromwell's ruthless efficiency. He had not only built the machinery of a sovereign national state, but had also proven its utility as a tool for political execution. In doing so, he made himself indispensable, but also set the precedent for his own vulnerability. The price of his power was absolute obedience to the king's increasingly deadly impulses. Cromwell's administrative machine, so effective at removing a queen, proved disastrous at choosing one. After Jane Seymour's death in childbirth left Henry with a single, fragile heir, Cromwell arranged a marriage with the German princess Anne of Cleves to secure a Protestant alliance. It was a sound geopolitical move that failed to account for the king's vanity. Seduced by a flattering portrait, Henry agreed to the match, sight unseen. Upon meeting his bride in 1540, he was repulsed, famously dubbing her the Flanders mare. The marriage was a humiliation, never consummated and annulled within 6 months. For Cromwell, the failure was absolute. He had mismanaged the king's ego, and the price was his head, demonstrating that even the architect of the English state was disposable. Freed from the German alliance, Henry swung from cold strategy to reckless indulgence. His fifth marriage was to Catherine Howard, the teenage niece of the Duke of Norfolk. Aging, obese, and suffering from a festering leg wound, the king sought to recapture his youth with a vivacious wife he called his Rose Without a Thorn. It was a predictable catastrophe. Catherine had a history of sexual indiscretion and continued her affairs as queen, most notably with courtier Thomas Culpeper. In Henry's court, this was not infidelity, but high treason. When her liaisons were exposed in 1541, the king's fantasy shattered. He reportedly wept with rage before ordering her execution. Her fate was the inevitable outcome of placing a naive girl into the lethal machinery of a court ruled by a paranoid autocrat. The final phase of Henry's marital cycle was one of resignation. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was a mature, twice-widowed woman chosen not for dynastic ambition, but for companionship. She acted as a nurse to the ailing king and a capable stepmother to his 3 children, helping reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Her role was to manage the king's decline and ensure a stable transition. This practical marriage signaled the exhaustion of Henry's obsessive quest. With his health failing, the focus shifted from producing more heirs to consolidating the Tudor line through his son Edward and preparing the regency that would rule after his death. The cycle of obsession had burned out, replaced by the necessity of securing the dynasty's future. Henry VIII's legacy is a study in contradiction. The myth of the great king who forged a modern nation collapses under the weight of his selfish, destructive rule. The administrative state was engineered by brilliant ministers like Wolsey and Cromwell, men he discarded once they failed his personal tests of loyalty. The English Reformation itself was not a theological crusade, but an accidental byproduct of his desperate need for an annulment. He secured the Tudor dynasty, but the human cost was immense. His reign is the ultimate verdict on power. A nation can be transformed not by a leader's vision, but by the sheer, consuming force of his vanity.